3 years ago, I was in first year photography in uni, and my lecturer asked if any of us were gamers. No one answered because it was kind of cringe, but he went on to talk about video game photography, and I remember just thinking it sounded ridiculous. I really like documentary photography, capturing reality and nature and people and real things. And video games are just fantasy, there's nothing real about them. So the whole idea of video game photography just sounded daft, it sounded pointless. But it's been 3 years and I'm ready to revisit the whole concept. This is going to be a 3-part deep dive into in-game photography, exploring its history and its current state, the different forms it takes, the best games for it, if it's any fun, and if you can actually make some good photographic art in-game. Basically, I'm looking to find out if I was right and this is all pointless and cringe, or if this whole time I've been wrong. In part 1, this video, we're going to cover photography games, that is, games that are about photography or require in-game photography in order to progress. Yes, they do actually exist. In part 2, we're going to explore and try out in-game photography in games that have a photo mode or a cinematic mode, and I'm sure a few come to mind. And in part 3, we're going to look at games that have none of the above, but do have an interesting vibe, aesthetic, or art style that makes for cool in-game imagery. Before we get started, make sure to drop a like and hit subscribe. I've got so much photography content on the way, covering a whole broad range within this genre, so if that sounds like your kind of thing, this might be the place for you. Let's get started with part 1. Photo games. Games in which taking photos using an in-game camera is a core gameplay mechanic. It is actually a significant enough genre to warrant having its own Wikipedia page, which as of researching this video is news to me. The wiki page lays out the definition as this. A photography game is a video game genre in which taking photographs using the in-game camera system is a key game mechanic. Photography games often employ mechanics similar to a first-person shooter, but rather than using a gun to kill enemies, the goal is to use a camera to take photographs of things in the game world. The wiki page also states that the game that started this genre, the first of its kind, was a Commodore 64 game called Nessie, published in 1984. You can kind of play Nessie on this website, but it doesn't really work very well at all. But you can see here that it looks pretty rudimentary and the mechanics are pretty simple. But this was a Commodore 64 game, and I suppose for the time it was made, it was well ahead of its time. The next photography game of note, and I say of note loosely here because this one also looks a bit rough, is Gekibo, Gekisha Boy, which was published in 1992. This game, from what I can find, had a sequel, Gekibo, Gekisha Boy 2, that has a lost or unreleased English version which was going to be called Polaroid Pete. This is a Japanese cult classic which has you snapping shots of bizarre things, and I mean bizarre. At one point there's a bloke who flashes you and you take his picture, I don't know. But basically you take photos of weird things in this environment whilst dodging obstacles. And although this sounds utterly thrilling, this isn't quite what we're looking for from a photography game. So let's move on. Next up is Paparazzi, Tales of Tinseltown. This game was published in 1995, a good couple of years before I was born, so speaking out of a complete guess here, but 1995 must have been jam-packed full of drugs, because you'd have to have been on some absolute substances to produce a game like this, and I mean that there's a diss and a compliment. This game is a fever dream. You don't exactly take photos in this game, at least not with any significant control over the shots. So it's again not quite what we're looking for from a photography game, but if I had to experience this, so do you.
Are they too much woman to handle?
We're not mean people by nature. It's just a service.
We know where you were last night. We know what you did.
This is News 1.
Rob, could you tell us about your drunk driving charges? Has the little girl recovered from her coma yet?
That is enough for today.
Now for another cult classic, one that's pretty well known, so much so that it recently got a sequel in 2021, and this is Pokemon Snap. In the traditional Pokemon games, you collect Pokemon in Pokeballs, trapping them in your balls possibly for eternity, so that you can force them to fight other Pokemon. Everyone knows these games, most people have played them. Good stuff. Well, in Pokemon Snap you are also collecting Pokemon, but you leave your balls at home and instead you take out a camera and you collect the Pokemon by snapping photos of them. This game was a massive step in the right direction for photography games, as instead of being an arcadey side scroller, or whatever the bloody hell this is.
I left my nose in Schnauzer City.
It's actually a first-person photography game. Unfortunately, this game isn't free roam, and neither is the new Pokemon Snap. You kind of just glide through a set path and snap photos of Pokemon doing their thing as you pass them. But it's still pretty cool, especially considering that this game came out in 1999. I've not played this game as it's a little before my time, and I don't have an N64 to play the original or a Switch to play the sequel, but I think I'd have loved this game as a kid. You go through the level taking your photos, and then at the end of the level your photos are graded, so you're actually rewarded for taking better shots, as far as the game can actually dictate what a good and a bad shot is. Pokemon Snap was massively influential and actually sparked a whole subgenre of photography games that we're going to call the Safari games. There's been a decent few of these over the years, more than you'd expect to be honest, but the premise of all of these games is pretty much the same. The environment is filled with either real animals or fantasy creatures, and you take photos of them. Exhilarating. So far, Snap is the first game here getting a thumbs up from me. Pretty cool. Fast forward a couple of years to 2001, and we get the first instalment of a 5.5, as one of them is a remake, part series of photography games with Fatal Frame. As the name suggests, these are horror games, survival horror games to be exact. And as the name also suggests, the camera in these games is used as a weapon. The premise of all the Fatal Frame games is spooky, scary, haunted location full of ghosts and ghouls and supernatural events, and for some reason you go through these haunted locations with nothing to protect yourself but a camera, which luckily damages the ghosts if you capture them on film. Different angles, distances and timings do different amounts of damage, with the best being a fatal frame. Photography is clearly a key gameplay mechanic, but these are horror games first and photography games like fifth, maybe? You're not trying to take good images or anything, so again it's not quite what we're looking for. So on to the next. Originally released in 2003 and just recently receiving a remaster with the 20th anniversary edition, we have Beyond Good and Evil. A game which sets you as an action fighter stroke reporter named Jade. The game is set on an alien planet and it has you exploring, fighting enemies, solving puzzles and of course taking photos. The planet is ruled by a corrupt power, and instead of picking up a gun to fight the resistance like most games would have you do, you pick up a camera and shoot photos of the enemies and the corruption in order to expose it and turn the tide of public opinion to fight the good fight. Now, you're not taking beautiful images and composing works of art. The game largely has you snapping shots of the life and the creatures on the planet, not too dissimilarly to the Safari games we covered earlier. But this mechanic and this concept is built upon and artfully mixed in with an engaging story, with characters that get many a compliment from fans, a vibrant game world, fun fighting mechanics and puzzles to solve, and lots of exploration. It doesn't feel like a gimmick or a wasted or forced feature, and it hugely contributes to the game's identity, and I can say without a shadow of a doubt I would have adored this game had I played it as a kid. Next up we've got a PS3 game from 2008 called Afrika. Afrika is one of those Safari games mentioned earlier which pulls a fair bit of inspiration from the likes of Pokemon Snap. I'd call this one the first proper photography game here though, but not a brilliant one. Probably not worth digging out the PS3, and that is largely because it's pretty outdated at this point. In the game you receive emails which tell you which animals to capture, you then head out and take your shots. Better photos earn more money with which you can buy upgrades and better gear. Within the mission areas the game is actually free roam. Unlike Pokemon Snap, you can actually walk around the environment, giving you far more freedom to compose your shots. There's a range of photography gear, some technical photography aspects to the mechanics, and the whole game is just about photography. That said, It is an older game and it looks it. Certainly a cool concept, certainly a step in the right direction for photography games, but not quite what we want out of a photography game in 2024 and beyond. Right, I'm going to speed through a whole bunch of games here, a mixture of photography games and games with photography mechanics needed to progress. A lot of these simply aren't photography enough or aren't stand out enough to warrant a whole long section. We'd probably be here for a very long time if we did that. But all of these do deserve a fair mention when talking about this topic. Dead Rising. The Dead Rising games are mostly just zombie slaying kill 'em all games, and most of the gameplay mechanics revolve around that. But in some of the games you play as Frank West, a photojournalist, or you play alongside him, and the game has you taking photos on an in-game camera in order to progress. It's not one of the main features, it's not at the forefront of the game, but it is there. Life is strange. In this narrative adventure game, you play as Max, a young photography student who carries an instant camera, kinda like a copyright-safe Polaroid. Now, every website I can find calls the photography mechanic a main gameplay feature, but from what I can find, it is exclusively used to take what the game itself calls optional photos. So go figure. These photos are collectibles and they're all already set, they're all predetermined. You don't go through any photographic process. You just see an interesting, to Max at least, thing, press the button or key prompted, and the animation runs, bang, there's your photo. Alba, a wildlife adventure. This is a wholesome, charming little game with a really cool concept and a sound message. It's described as a chilectathon, and that's pretty bang on as you explore and play at your own pace and collect photos of each species of animal on the island. I really like how this game uses photography as a feature and combines it with collecting and discovery. It reminds me almost like a fully in-game Pokemon Go, or there's an app that I got called Merlin, which allows you to discover what different birds are, and to have a game set around a concept like that as a mechanic is pretty cool. Toem, a photo adventure. This is a photography stroke puzzle game. The game has you go through a bunch of Scandinavian towns and cities full of NPCs which ask for your help, essentially giving you puzzles to solve, which you do by taking photos on your camera. You play the game from a top-down perspective, which switches to a first-person perspective when you're taking photos, so it's pretty cool to have that different range of different perspectives, to see that world from different angles. Now, I do think you're pretty limited with the art style when it comes to taking in-game photos. You're not really going to be shooting anything you'd consider framing in this game, but it is a photography game through and through. Nuts. This is a surveillance mystery game in which you record the actions of squirrels and uncover some great secret. Okay, this isn't technically a photography game. We're blurring the lines a little bit here. But there are some photographic elements with the mechanics, especially around the cameras and setting up the shots, and the art style is simple yet beautiful, so I thought it was worth a mention. Invisimals. Don't shoot me, but this one also isn't technically a photography game, but it is well deserving of an honourable mention all the same. I have vivid memories of playing this game as a kid on my PSP. It was incredible. Basically, on the PSP, and if you had a PSP back in the day, you might remember this, you could get a little attachment that clipped onto the PSP right on the top, and it was a little camera, and you could use this to use the PSP as a camera, and there was a lot of games as well that used it as a feature, and Invisimals was one of them. It was like augmented reality. Basically, you walk around wherever you are and look on the screen through the camera, and there would be these little creatures hiding around your house or your garden or wherever you were, and the aim was to tame them, to capture them, and then to fight with them. Pretty similar to Pokemon, but this was Invisimals. It was different. I've got to say, this was well ahead of its time. So was the PSP, to be fair. And I've got vivid and very fond memories of playing this game. All those games are well and good, and by the definitions, they meet the requirements to be classed as photography games. Maybe except those last two, but... Anyway, photography is more than can be simply defined. One of the more common modern definitions, as seen on Cambridge Dictionary, is simply the activity or job of taking photographs or filming. I've got to say, this definition is abysmal. You're saying that taking photographs is part of a definition for photography? That's like saying that to run is the act of running. Like, that's not how definitions work. We do have the somewhat better definition that Merriam-Webster gives, which is the art or process of producing images by the action of radiant energy, and especially light, on a sensitive surface. So that's certainly a better definition, but both of these are purely literal. Any of you out there that are photographers will know what I mean when I say that photography has a feeling embedded in the process and the ritual. The way that it slows you down, it makes you think, it creates an untouchable form of art, it holds a great amount of power. There is so much that is essential to the whole concept and identity and existence of photography that cannot be simply defined. The definitions just don't quite fulfill what photography truly is. And similarly, the definition of photography games just doesn't quite fulfill what a true photography game should be. It's too loose, it's too open, it's too vague. In my opinion, for a photography game to be deserving of that title, to really fit in that genre, it has to fit here, right here in the middle of a Venn diagram on which one side sits photography, what it truly is, and on the other side sits games and what the whole experience of playing an incredible game is. I'll be straight with you, there's really not many of these games. But I have found some. A whopping 6 to be exact. 6 games which I'm grouping together in a section I am completely unbiasedly and very creatively calling the good photography games. I'm going to go through these in order of worst to best. That said, all of these are good, hence why they're in this section. At number 6 we have Beasts of Maravilla Island. This is a safari photography game published in 2021. Frankly, the safari subgenre just doesn't do it for me, but this one certainly seems to be the best of the bunch. The game sets you as an aspiring wildlife photographer called Marina, who is following the path of her late granddad. This path takes her to the magical Maravilla Island, full of mystical creatures, and the game basically introduces you to these creatures and then sets you out to snap their picture. This is an incredibly linear format, so having so many of these games in existence actually gets a little bit boring. But Beasts of Maravilla Island does spice it up a little bit. The game actually wants multiple photos of each species doing different things, so you do actively have to take your time in observing these creatures in the wild to capture their different behaviours. Beasts of Maravilla Island beats the other currently available safari games for a few reasons. It has a charming art style that stands out amongst the other safari games, which allows you to create some pretty interesting images. It's a really chill, slow-paced photography game. Think rainy winter evening, rain pattering on your windows, candles on and playing through this game. That whole feeling matches perfectly with what this game offers. Out of all the safari games, this one offers the most photographic freedom. You can actually freely roam around the environment and you've got a decent zoom range, meaning you can compose to your will. To progress, the game has you taking photos of the beasts, but you can take photos of pretty much anything that you want on the island. All of that with an interesting story and a nice message. Now, this game is only short, 90 minutes long, so on one of those rainy evenings you could easily knock this whole thing out. It doesn't offer a great deal of replayability, but if you're a big fan of the aesthetic, there's no reason why you couldn't come back in and take more photos. For all those reasons, Beasts of Maravilla Island is the worst of the good photography games and the best of the safari photography games. To go off on a slight tangent, I just want to leave some of my comments about the safari genre. I do not think that we've had the best safari photography game yet. I do not think we've reached the peak of what that subgenre has to offer. There's some good concept out there, but I just think there could be something incredible made out of the safari photography whole idea. In my head, I'm thinking like Hunter, Call of the Wild, but instead of going around killing the animals, there is a whole wide range of these animals in an environment, and you go out and take their pictures, you discover where they are. You could perhaps be playing as a conservationist or something. There could be different environments from all around the world with a massive range of creatures and animals and critters and God knows what else. The game could reward you for taking these photos. You could maybe be a paid photographer or sent out on assignments or paid for discovery or something like that. I don't know. There's a lot that could be explored with that whole concept, but I do think that there could be a genuinely interesting and engaging, really, really good game made out of the safari subgenre. Anyway, on to the next game. At number 5, we have Firewatch. This isn't even a photography game, and yet it manages to be a better photography game than so many. Firewatch is an adventure game published in 2016 and set in the 1989 Wyoming wilderness. You play as Henry, a solitary fire lookout in the Shoshone National Forest, I think that's how you pronounce it. You play through an engaging story, full of mystery and suspense that has you explore the area around the lookout. So why is this game on the list? Fair question. Well, the game is about 4 hours long, and a bit less than an hour in, you find a disposable camera. As you further progress through the game, you have a limited number of shots that you can take at your will of anything. The photos you take are shown in the credits, summarising the journey that you've been on through the game. And at the early stages of this game's life, you could actually send your shots off for development, and the devs would send you your prints, which I think is very, very cool from the devs. That whole idea is really interesting. I wish I was there for that. Obviously, with it being a disposable camera, the amount of photos that you can take in the game is very limited to only 17 shots, I believe. But the game world is stunning and the colour palette is beautiful. And the camera mechanic fits perfectly into this game. You are not forced to do anything with it, you are free to capture whatever photos you want, and the game provides some incredible scenes and photo opportunities. Sure, you're not going to be playing this whole game just to take 17 in-game photos, but if you're looking for an interesting and engaging story with a perfectly placed photography mechanic that allows you to take genuinely pleasing in-game photos set in a delightful and artfully stylistic slice of rural America, then this game hits the nail on the head. In at number 4, we have Eastshade. Published in 2019, Eastshade is technically a painting game. However, the painting mechanic is pretty much just an in-game camera. You don't actually paint with a brush or a mouse or an analog stick, you just find the scene you wish to capture, frame your painting, and when you're happy you hit the button like a shutter and the painting fills itself in. So you can see how this is essentially a camera stroke photography mechanic disguised as painting. I really like this actually, it gives the game a unique identity and feeling within this list, and since the game is set, I mean obviously it's a fantasy setting, but it all feels oldie worldy, and I don't think a camera would have made sense or fit in this game's aesthetic. And if you want a photography game set in an environment or period that wouldn't have cameras, disguising that mechanic as painting like this is frankly a genius move. On my completely unbiased criteria for good photography games, this game hits a lot of marks. The art style is beautiful and perfectly fitting for the genre, the scenes that you come across that are just asking to be captured, and that's what this game is about. It's about making in-game art through the painting cum photo mechanic. That is the core of the game. Then there's the complete lack of direction, which sounds like a negative, but is actually a massive, huier feather in this game's cap, as it pushes you to explore the stunning game world and find photo or painting opportunities as you do. There is an interesting narrative, lots of NPCs with a really surprising amount of voice acting.
I'm glad to hear that.
You can spend a lot of time in this game world exploring and capturing all it has to offer. The paint and stroke photography mechanic is simple, yet different to most of these other photography games. You can freely move your character around, which of course helps you compose your shot. A lot of these games allow for this level of movement, but most games here would give you some kind of zoom mechanic to further compose. But not Eastshade. This game calls it cropping, and essentially it's just freely adjusting the aspect ratio of your photo or painting, which actually gives you a lot of scope for creativity. Other than the game having the odd glitch, which is not a complaint by any means, by the way, the only potential negative, or positive depending on what you're looking for, is that you can't just paint whenever and wherever you desire. You have to craft canvases and have enough inspiration, which is an in-game resource, in order to paint. If you're playing and exploring properly, this shouldn't be an issue, but I just thought it was worth mentioning. Overall, this is a really well done photography game, and all the priorities are in the right places. I've given a photographer's take on this game, but if you want a developer's take, head over to the Eastshade Studios YouTube channel, where you will find many videos on the conceptualization and the production of this masterpiece. At number 3, we have Season, A Letter to the Future. Published in 2023, Season, A Letter to the Future, which for the rest of this section I'm just going to call Season, is a highly awarded narrative-focused adventure game in which you, playing as Estelle, discover and tell the story. This is in many ways a documentary game, And without spoiling anything, the plot has you exploring and documenting the game world and uncovering its many stories and secrets for the next generation before a mysterious cataclysm destroys everything. Mechanically, you do this by filling your journal, which is the central focus of the game, and you fill it with writing, drawings, recording, audio and videos, and of course taking photos. You are free to document the story you uncover as you please, taking photos of anything that tickles your fancy, but the game does prompt points of interest for potential photo opportunities. It goes without saying, but Season has an enthralling aesthetic which lends itself perfectly to the game's story and setting, as well as to the photos that you can take. Along with the visuals, the game has tasteful sound effects and a beautiful soundtrack which complements the story and environment even further. All that with a well-awarded story and a great sense of adventure makes for an engaging, immersive and cosy experience which is built around capturing the world that you are in. You shoot on an instant camera with a surprisingly fleshed out set of photography mechanics. You can change the depth of field, the zoom, the camera angle, you can pick from a range of filters, and of course you can move freely around the game world in order to find and compose your shots. You are locked into that Polaroid square kind of aspect ratio, but with all the other mechanics of documentation at your disposal, this doesn't really feel like much of a creative hindrance. I think Season is a prime example of a well-melded mix of story, exploration, beauty, documentary and photography, and it is a tasteful balance of all of these things that you will struggle to find anywhere else. In its second place we have Umurangi Generation. Released in 2020, Umurangi Generation is a rarity, as it is a first-person photography simulation game that is actually well deserving of that genre definition, which is a pretty rare genre definition anyway. The game sets you as a photographer in, and I quote, the shitty future. You are given a brief for essential photos to progress, as well as optional photos for extra rewards, and of course you can shoot outside of these briefs as well. You are shooting on film, meaning you have a limited amount of photos. However, in each of the environments you can find hidden roles which will allow you to take more shots. As you progress you would unlock more gear, such as cameras and lenses and flashes, which greatly broadens the kinds of photos that you can take as you move along through the game. With this being a through and through dedicated photography game, it has the most advanced photo mechanics we've seen so far. The array of different equipment, especially the lenses, adds a lot of depth to the photographic process and to the kinds of images that you can make. The standard, other than zoom, the main things that you control before shooting are depth of field and your point of focus. And with the DLC, the game also introduces ISO and shutter speed controls, further expanding your photographic freedoms. And then there's the editing suite. When you take a shot, you can edit your photos before finalising them. In the early game, you've only got a couple of sliders to play with, but by the late game, you've got a whole stack of sliders to mess around with. Literally the best in-game photography mechanics anywhere as of July 2024, and I reckon it's probably going to stay that way for quite a while. Along with the mechanics, Umurangi also offers a highly stylised art style, which makes for a good balance of kind of relatable, realistic scenarios and scenes with a surreal layer of icing on top. All of that with a banger of a soundtrack. The game's not too long, about 3 hours for the main story and 5 to 100% it. Add on an extra hour and a half for the highly recommended DLC, but with so much to unlock as you progress, Umurangi makes revisiting all levels fun and adds a lot of replayability. Speaking of the main story, without spoiling anything, you are a photographer and you get paid for each shot that you take. Better shots yield higher payments, and the game explains at the beginning what it classes as better shots before you play. It's through this mechanic that you earn new gear and progress to new levels. A true photography game, one I'd be very interested to play on this channel. If that's something you'd like to watch, do let me know. Believe it or not, this game was actually made by one bloke, and I apologise in advance if I butcher the name, I'm awful with name pronunciation, but that is Naftali Faulkner. What a legend. For the number one spot, I'm going to have to blue ball you a little bit, as this game isn't actually released yet. Unless you're watching this in the future, and then your balls may well be normal coloured. Anyway, at number one, we have Lushfoil. This one is also a solo development, this time by Matt Newell, and on Steam it is self-described as a tranquil exploration and photography experience set across a vast selection of faithfully detailed landscapes. It's going to be great when this comes out to have a nature set, landscape orientated photorealistic, genuinely good photography game to contrast Umurangi's urban, street photography orientated, stylistic, genuinely good photography game experience. Unfortunately, with this game not out yet, there's not really a great deal of detail to go into, but you're seeing what I'm seeing here. It looks incredible. There was actually a demo a little bit ago which I missed, but from that we do have some reviews on Steam, and one in particular stood out to me. A detailed photography game. Each environment is filled with objectives to reward players that have a good eye for angles and perspectives, and hidden secrets for those who are patient and observant. So it's good to know that this game isn't going to be one-dimensional, and that there are going to be goals, objectives, briefs, rewards, secrets, all things that I think are necessary to a good photography game. On the website Annapurna Interactive, we find a bit more information about the game, and if you want to pause, you can read all of that, but the bits that really stand out to me are the camera simulates settings such as manual / autofocus, flash, exposure, contrast, white balance, aperture, burst shot and other effects, find unlockable cameras, find a first-person drone, find a hidden kayak. Now, I think these are really good insight into what this game's going to offer. The fact that the actual photography mechanics are going to be in depth, and it says here what you'd expect from a real-world professional DSLR, so that's going to be really interesting to see. And it's going to give you more freedom to compose and to take actual artful photos through all of those mechanics than any photography game that we've seen so far. Then when it says find unlockable cameras, that is obviously suggesting that there is going to be more than one camera in the game, that there's going to be unlockable gear. I would imagine therefore there'll probably be lenses and similar things like that to change and mess around with. There's a first-person drone which would unlock a whole new level of freedom in exploration and in-game photography. And then when it says find a hidden kayak, I think that's interesting because it obviously is indicating that there's going to be a good range of freedom of movement that you can do with your character. You won't just be stuck to walking straight paths, but I mean, if you can go on water, it wouldn't surprise me if you could go up in the air, if you can climb things, if you can perhaps drive. I think this game's going to have a hell of a lot to offer. I think a game like Lushfoil is going to have extreme educational benefits as well. I'm just thinking of maybe a photography class in a city where those kids can't get out to the countryside to take landscape photography, but they could use this game to practice the techniques and the lighting and the composition and to greatly expand their understanding of this whole genre of photography. And I think that's incredible. Or maybe underprivileged students that can't get access to cameras and stuff. This could still be a really good way to learn many of the important rules of photography and the techniques, and yeah, I think this could have a really good place in education. There is actually a Lushfoil Discord that I joined, unfortunately too late to get in on the demo, but we move. And there's some pretty cool stuff in here. You can ask the dev Matt some questions, you can get updates on the game and on the release and stuff like that, but also there is a whole tab, there's a whole chat just for sharing photos in the game for those that did get to play the demo, and there is some pretty cool stuff in there. You can see that some of these look incredible, some of them look scarily realistic, and it's pretty clear that this game is giving a lot of freedom and accuracy in that photographic process to make some pretty cool looking in-game photos. I mean, it's clear on this one, at least to me that's what it looks like, that a slow shutter speed has been used for a creative effect, and to know that you can do that and it can have this kind of result is really interesting. This all looks really, really quite good, and I'm really looking forward to this coming out. I will be playing this game on this channel, there is no doubt about that, and frankly I can't wait. Well, that's all the photography games for this video. This was by no means a comprehensive or complete list of all photo games, but it was the most poignant and the best that I could find. Now to gather my thoughts, what do I think? Honestly, I didn't know games like this, photography games, even existed before I started researching for this video, so to find out that such a thing even exists is pretty cool in and of itself. Now obviously a lot of these games were dire, but some of them were actually pretty cool looking, and no doubt I will be playing at least a handful of them at some point myself. In concept, in practice, a lot of these actually look quite fun, and there's at least a few in which you can take some genuinely good looking images. So what sounded to me at the beginning like a pretty odd idea might not be so odd after all. Do I think I'll be spending a lot of time taking photos in games? Well, maybe we'll have to wait to answer that question until we've been through the other parts. If you like this video or this format, it's something I've not done before, and you want to support me and the channel, then the best way to do that is to interact with this video. Leave a like, drop a comment. I am especially interested to hear about your experience playing any of these games if you have, or if you found a game on this list that you plan on playing. And of course, if you would like to see me play through any of the games on this list, just let me know, as that is definitely something I would be interested in doing as long as there's some demand for it. And if you would like to see more like this and more videos just about photography in general, then hit subscribe because I've got loads on the way. And don't forget, there's another 2 parts to this series looking at in-game photography, so make sure to tune back in for those. If you watched this full video and stuck around to the end, then thank you, like truly thank you. This video took a lot of time to research and to write and to put together, so please know I really do appreciate you sticking around and watching this whole thing. It means a lot. Yeah, and that's all from me. Sound for watching. I'll see you in the next one.